This etude, Walking to a Train Station, is based on the changes to Take the A Train, which of course is a very famous jazz standard composed by Billy Strayhorn. And this song is a nice study because it's an AABA form, just like we've checked out before in previous etudes. And it has a couple of sections where the chords last for more than one bar. So in the first 4 bars, we have a C chord, a C major, C6, C major 7 for 2 bars, and then into a D7. So that gives us an opportunity to stretch out and create a melodic arc that we've been working on with our bass line. So we just start out this etude with a walking 4. So in that little phrase is a 2-measure phrase. We have a beginning and an ending. And the beginning and ending are both feature the note C, the root of the chord. So in this case, we're going to start with a C, and then our arc is going to go down low and then gradually move back up to C. So again, this concept of thinking like an architect will help you out when you compose your bass lines and then ultimately improvise, because you can start to think of just directions. Do we want to go up? Do we want to go down? Do we want to stagger the bass line? There's all of these choices that you can make. In this case, we're going to dive down and then gradually move our way back up to where we started on the root. So it's down. Notice on the first beat of the second bar, we're playing the 5th, which is an important chord tone of C. This note is G, which is the 5th of C6. And then we're just going to move right up to C on beat 4 using scale tones of C major. And that will lead us into D7. We could chromatically approach the D7, but we don't have to. Kind of sounds nice to end on the C on the 4th beat of the second bar, and then that would be a scale tone approach into D7. Now, our arc is going to be moving up. So we do the same type of motion that we did in the first bar, which is this chromatic from the 3rd to the 5th. That kind of cliche line. With the D7 in bar 3, we're going to do the same line, but transpose the D and now moving up. So we're going to go. And that's nice because it kind of reinforces our melodic arc that we've created in the first 2 measures. But it also gives a little bit of contrast because we're moving in a little bit of a higher register. We're going to, on the first beat of bar 4, we're going to resolve to a 5th and then just take it right down a triad arpeggio. 3, 1, and then open A for the 5th there. So you have this kind of nice line with those 4 bars. So even though you're playing a bass line, you're also making a melodic statement, which is really nice. From there, we move through some changes. So in measure 5, we just basically have a bar of D minor 7 that's going to connect to a G7. So we're going to just do that using scale tones and a chromatic approach. Scale tones, or actually chord tones in this case, we're going to go root, flat 7, 5, just right down the 7th arpeggio, but then a chromatic approach with the A flat to G. And again, that gives us kind of a little bit of a blues flavor in there, which is nice, moving from a 2 to a 5. Then we're going to continue moving down from a G7 to an F7. So this is going to end our first phrase. So rather than just hang on a G7 for all that time, we're going to go in some new different directions. So in this case, we're going to do kind of our classic 3-6-2-5. And we're going to get to the 3 via chromatic approach with the F7 chord. And since as also another signal of entering to the next phrase, the second A section, we're going to do something different with by dropping chords in. So we're going to use this constant structure of 13th chords, and then into the E7 sharp 9, which still retains that 13th sound because the chord structure itself is the same. And then we're home back to C. So that phrase from 5 to measure 8 is chord jab, chord jab. And in both cases, for the dominant seventh chords, the A7 and the G7, we'll treat both of those as altered or just add a sharp 5 in there because both of them are resolving to their respective ones. So A7 is resolving to a D, A to D is a 5-to-1 relationship, and G7 is resolving to C, another 5-to-1 relationship. So we can make both of those dominant chords altered in quality. But we could also play 13, so it's up to you. How would it sound? Well, here's E7 to A13. Sounds pretty good. D minor, G13. Doesn't sound bad, but what I like about using the sharp 5s in there is now you have this chromatic line on top. And again, this is another component to our building, our concept of building melodic arcs. E, the E7 chord has a G on top, down to an F, down to an E, down to a D sharp, and that will resolve to a D note on top of a C6-9. So in context, all right, moving into our second A section, we're going to add another note on top. And, if you were looking at the real book and looking at the, reading a lead sheet, these changes are, it could have just a C triad, a C major seventh chord. You might see that symbol. But a nice all-purpose chord voicing that you can use for whether it's a major triad or a major seventh is a 6-9 voicing. And that's really nice because it doesn't have anything as distinctive as the major seventh interval. I mean, as soon as you play that major seventh, that's really saying something. It really sticks out. But the C6, it's a little more neutral. So it'll work with a triad, and then if you add the 9, it's pretty much a neutral voicing that will work in any context. So we're going to use that for our first C chord of this phrase. And we're going to play kind of a variation on the Charleston rhythm over two bars. So the chords are comped with this rhythm. And in doing that, I was kind of imagining what the horn section might sound like in a big band. If we were listening to Duke Ellington Orchestra, you might have this melody that you would play, you'd play the song with a singer or a melodic instrument such as a horn playing the melody. And behind that, you might want to emulate the sound of a horn section doing kind of a question and answer type of thing, So that's usually the case when I'm creating arrangements, whether they're for solo guitar or if I'm just improvising an accompaniment for a singer to create this orchestral type of sound, a very full-bodied approach to comping. I'll try to imagine, well, what would a piano player do, or what would a big band sound like, and how can I capture that essence? So one way to do that would be by using these repetitive rhythmic figures that are in contrast to this moving quarter note bass line. It's a really nice effect. So if we were to, again, isolate the chords for those first two chords of C6-9 moving into D9, we've got this. 1, 2, 3, and 2, 3. So it's almost kind of like a little big band doing some question and answers to the melody. When you add those on top of the bass line, it sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, and. Let me try that again. 1, 2, 3, and. And then we move into the D minor. A couple of other quick things to note about those 4 bars. When we play the C6-9, because we're using kind of a larger chord voicing, we've got 4 notes on the top and then a bass line. I'm kind of rolling off with my hand because, again, you want the bass line to sustain. So as soon as you play that C6-9, you're off. And the way to do that is just to release, and I'm exaggerating the motion right now, but I'm almost kind of tilting my hand a little bit to get off that chord. So the way that I'm able to release it is almost by kind of like hinging my hand open and closed. Now, this is an example of using an open string to our advantage. This is kind of a tricky chord voicing to nail every time. It's a D9 with a sharp 11 on top. So it's just your standard D9 voicing, dominant 9. But you have to do a partial bar with your index finger to nail that G sharp at the top there. So So rather than trying to move a bass line underneath that, we can opt to just staying in position so we can keep that chord voicing together once we grab it. And then just take off the middle finger to roll back and forth between the D, open A. Then we can take advantage of that open A string on beat 4 to move up into the higher position into measure 13 to grab this voicing for the D minor 7. And we've talked about this minor 7 voicing over the course of these etudes. This is an example of using the 2 and then the 3, this sort of partial bar fingering for this one. Again, because where we're going will define what we use for a fingering. So in this case, we're going to go right up the scale and chromatically approach G7. So because I'm moving in this direction with my bass line, I'm going to finger it with 2 and 3, because if I fingered it this way, it would take too much effort to go back here with my first finger. You know, I could go up this way, but in this case, I'm choosing to start the chord with the back of the hand and use my first finger to ascend from there. So that move from measure 13 into 14 is... And that's another pull off to nowhere. We're just kind of pulling off to the A string and then muting it as soon as we pull it off. And then answering it with that B note on the 7th fret, E string, sorry. Okay, now we're into the bridge. And this one is pretty standard. Now we have 4 bars of the same chord. So one concept that a lot of jazz players like to do when they're comping is if you have 4 measures of the same chord, you can kind of inject little chord substitutions. And the most common one would be to just simply insert a 2-5 in there. And that's exactly what we do in measure 18. We're kind of ending this 2-bar phrase by throwing in a 2-5 of F. And so if we were to look at those chords, instead of just playing 2 bars of F major 7, we're playing F and then 2, 5, back to F6. And this is the way that we capture it here. And again, what that does is it just sets up a little bit of motion in an otherwise static chord progression. Then we're back into F6. We use our line cliche in tenths that we saw earlier. And then again, that's just a nice variation from this constant chord jabbing. So it's nice to always look for ways to break up something that happens too often. If to prevent your comping from sounding monotonous or the same thing over and over again, we can just use these subtle little devices and drop them in. A little bit will go a long way. So in this case, we're just dropping in some tenths. Now we're into 2 bars of D9, and we'll just play that D9 straight up with a chord jab. Now notice, I want to be in the higher region of the neck now, so instead of resolving back to this D, I'm going to resolve to the D and the low E string. So in this way, we're kind of taking advantage of some of the inherent disadvantages of the guitar, or assuming to be disadvantages, one of which is the multiple ways that you can play one note on the guitar. Everybody kind of complains about that. You're like, well, there's 5 middle Cs in the guitar, and that's what prevents a lot of people from sight reading. But in this case, we can use multiple locations for one pitch to our advantage by being able to use this D, or even the open D. We can use that same pitch in the same octave range in 3 different places, depending on what we need to get done in terms of a chord voicing or a direction that we want to move in. So in this case, we're going to move up to a higher position. We're going to D minor 7 now. And then this is just a real quick chord substitution. Instead of going right to the G7 there in measure 24, we're going to just throw in a dominant 7th chord, A flat 7, a half step above G. And that's just a real common substitution that we hear both in traditional electric blues styles as well as jazz. And it's just, again, it's a nice little turn in the road that we can take. So 2, up to a flat 6, and And now we're home with our tonic, C6 in measure 25. Now, just again to continue with this concept of a big band kind of shout idea, we've got this this 4-bar phrase that incorporates both chord voicings and the tenths moving with our line cliche. So 25 is... And then we can move that up chromatically to the D, and then hit another chord figure. So we're using the concept of repetition to add some strength and further reinforce our accompaniment here. So those two phrases are D, and then we're back into D minor 7. And now we're moving down into a lower position just to get us set up for the tag at the end. So we're using kind of the classic ending to a lot of jazz and blues songs. But here's a couple of ideas for some tags if you want to prolong that just a little bit. We can put in some different chords. So in measure 32, we see an F over G, which is a real standard kind of 5-chord voicing here. The F over G is, you could also think of it as a G13 sus, but it's nice because it is a 5 chord, but it's not quite a fully resolved 5 chord. In other words, it's not a 5 chord that feels like it's going to end with a resolution to the 1. It still wants to, hang on for a little bit. So we're just going to repeat that lick again in 33. And then we can go to a more dissonant chord voicing this time. In this case, it's a D flat triad over G. And that's kind of another question mark. We're not ready to end it just yet. Finally, we'll wrap it up in measure 35. And we have this E in the melody up there, but it's still a relatively dissonant chord with a G13 flat 9. And we'll go into one last riff, but in order to prevent it from sounding all the same again, we'll take it up an octave. And that kind of signals, okay, something else is different. Maybe we're finally going to end it. Because up until that point, it's kind of like an open-ended question. It's like, where is this thing going to end? So if you needed to buy yourself some time in a gig situation, for whatever reason, you could kind of keep that low riff going for as many chords as you wanted. But when we're finally ready to wrap it up, we'll finish it by taking up an octave and then ending it with whatever chord voicing. In this case, it's a nice altered sound. So we have some resolution by hitting the tonic and the bass, but we have a nice chord structure on top by using a C7 sharp 9 flat 5 voicing. Favorite chord voicing of Joe Pass?